Good afternoon, everybody. I think I'm going to tell a little bit about my personal life and in the early teenagers. I was very interested in meditation and altered states of consciousness because I was fascinated with, I believe it was terror movies and everything. And I started having some experiences, like out-of-body experiences, and very interesting opening in terms of consciousness, and this came early in my life. So that really put me on track in terms of what I wanted to do in life. And I went to study psychology, and right in the very first year of my freshman year, I went into studying operant conditioning in the psychology lab here in the University of São Paulo. This lab was funded actually by, I think, Thorndike. If you people know the founding fathers of operant conditioning and the theory of learning and behaviorism. And this lab here in São Paulo has had, I don't know if it still has, but when I joined them, they were developing really advanced work on operant conditioning with Murray Siedman and Catani and this kind of people. And I had the privilege to be part of these research groups. So after that, that's where I got my master's degree on neuroscience. And from there, I was really starting to develop my work here in Brazil. I went to a bookshop, and I believe it was the only copy of Anna's book, Awakening the Mind, that came to South America, I believe so. You know, I ran into this book on the shelf, and I started reading, and that was it. I needed to go and train with Anna. In no more than, I believe, 3 or 4 months, I was there starting my training with Anna, which Judith was also in, and that's where we met and became friends. I believe friends for life. It's been more than a decade that we know each other and everything. Getting certified with Anna was really a cornerstone in my life. And after that, I went into studying more deeply neurofeedback. And then I trained with Margaret Ayers. That opened my mind also in other ways, that expanded the understanding of this work. Nowadays, what I do is neurofeedback, essentially, which is aimed at treatment of brain disorders or mental disorders, things like depression, ADHD, autism, OCD, all that stuff. And I have a clinic here in São Paulo. I was the pioneer in Z-score neurofeedback training in Brazil. I was the first Brazilian to get DCIA certified. That's pretty much where I am nowadays. This book is my third book. I had the privilege to have Anna Weiss write the preface for my first book. That was really outstanding, and had the happiness of taking one copy of it and giving it to her while she was alive, and that was fantastic. So this third book is for the, I don't know if everybody knows, the For Dummies collection. And the For Dummies is I believe we could call it a franchise, and it's published in 16 or 17 languages around the world. Here in Brazil, we have the For Dummies. It's called Para Leigos, and I was invited by them, which is also a very nice thing to have in your curriculum, to write the mental health with no meds for dummies. It's written only in Portuguese, and I hope that when they meet once in a year, and they should have this meeting next year, my book could be considered as one of the local titles that actually end up being translated into English and published in the USA. This book is 420 pages. It has lots of information. I'm going to go really fast here because I don't want to get off track from our presentation today. I'm just going to briefly describe the book, but the first part relates to why we don't need, why not meds? So like antidepressants, anxiolytics, and benzos, and what's the true story behind these meds, and why they actually are not the best option to treat these conditions. And then on the second part, I go into the diagnosis of conditions based on biomarkers, which is the latest trend in terms of mental health in the world. It is based on the work that is being developed by the National Institutes of Mental Health, and it's called Research Domain Criteria, RDOC. And then I describe the networks that are, so part of what we're going to see today is also content of the second part of the book. And then on the third part of the book, I describe non-invasive, non-med-based ways of treating all these conditions that I just described. So I talk about Z-score neurofeedback. I have a chapter on nutrition and high performance of the brain. This chapter just itself is 50 pages. And then I have a chapter, which is the content that we're going to talk about today, on meditation. And then on the fourth part, I give a very program for starting your practice of meditation and going beyond. So that's it. So the book is described, and now let's get down to business. Networks and the process that happens inside the brain when we start to meditate. So I just described my CV, the evolution of human consciousness. Where are we aimed at? And this is where the normal everyday life state of consciousness in our modern societies, it happens everywhere. It happens here in Brazil, in the US, in Europe, wherever you are. People are really disconnected from their inner beings, and from an evolutionary point of view, it's the meditative state is probably what I would say God left as a work to be done. Because we have a gap. As the brain evolved, it made in a saltatory or jumping from one level of neurological acquisition to another. So we had the reptilian, then the mammalian, and then the neocortex. And just in between the mammalian and the neocortex, there is this gap. And this gap is what prevents us from exactly accessing the actual content that is in theta, which is the limbic system. Why does that happen, actually? When we are born, we need to get out of the wombs of our mothers at the 9th month, because if we stay there longer, we won't pass and we won't be able to be born, because the actual circumference of the head starts to grow significantly. And this is related to the frontal lobes. When we are children, we can see that really clear. All the development of the neocortex is still taking place. So we live our childhood, most of it, until our 9 or 10th year of age, with our consciousness sitting on our limbic system. And this is where we all know is fantasy, the creativity and everything is sitting there too. And in such a way that if a child is to use a Batman suit, he is Batman, actually. And so we leave all this in a very intense way. And then when we approach that 10th, 11th year, there is a change and a transfer of the consciousness from the limbic to the neocortex. And this is quite intense. And the child that we've been gets frozen there, neurologically speaking. And this is to become the inner child that the psychoanalysis describes. And now we have a problem because we are functioning in much faster, much dynamic system. And part of who we were is there in a much more slower system with a problem, which is a low amplitude functioning. And this relates not only to the theta band, but also to the alpha band that is on an everyday life state of functioning, also not produced as it should. This is the problem that is presented. In evolutionary terms, you could look at the brain as a house that was built for a couple just recently married, and as they got children, this house was expanded, but the couple every time would call a different architect to do the jobs. It's very different every stage of evolution of the brain. And that's why we have very clear difficulty to establish this connection. And that's why I said that probably this is what God left us to do. Because once we do that, once we reconnect these two stages, we recover our capacity of integrating emotion into reasoning, which is what leads to wisdom. As one evolves into a meditative practice, what you see necessarily, if this is a true practice, is the development of wisdom, is change happening there, because there is the adult self reconnecting with the child that is there, neurologically speaking, still present. And this contact and this interaction leads to the maturing of this very archaic psychological being that one carries within. So if anyone has any question, you can ask me there. This is the gap. This is the problem. What does this all mean exactly, right? Two things. That we need to reestablish, optimize the flow of information between the limbic system and the neocortex. And this is what we could call awakening. And from there, to allow the evolutionary potential of the brain to unfold. This process is what we could call enlightenment. This is all the stages of development in meditation, like the awakened mind, the evolved mind, and beyond, with other higher levels that Kay described from the Hindu system, are what we could call the process of enlightenment. And this is higher levels of integration that we go step after step. And so let's study how these things happen in the brain. How can we do it? As we were talking, it's time to network. So let's go into networks and let's see what is this all about. These two guys, Van den Heuvel and Sporns, they did an amazing job in describing, and I'm sorry, this slide is in Portuguese, but I'm going to read it all and you can. So this is the connectome. And it's a map of these red spheres that you see are the hubs of the main networks in the brain. So this was really astonishing work that these two guys did. to actually map the hubs and establish what they call the Rich Club, which is this main network that runs on the midline of the brain, and everything else is built around this, what we could call backbone of the brain. And this is very interesting because, as we're going to see, everything happens in this midline structure in terms of consciousness. There are two types of networks in the brain. First, there are the structural networks, where the connections are hardwired, like here you have the language network, and everything is set. Every human being is going to bring each one of these networks set this way. We have no choice unless we develop a new species. So this is it. Everyone has the same set. And then there are the functional networks, which are basically the same in every human being too, but they are not hardwired as the structural networks. But these areas in different places of the brain, they have their activity really correlated one with the other. They are highly coherent. So this is the way they were discovered and mapped, because Reiko is the guy that back in the 90s, I put 2015 because this is a review study from Reiko, where he describes the discovery of this first network that is the default mode network, where he would see some brain areas really behaving like this. The activity would, even though they were really far away from each other in the brain, they would really behave as one in terms of functioning. These three main networks, the default mode network, the central executive network, and the Salience network, are the three main networks that we use in terms of our cognitive and functioning, in terms of emotions, and in terms of our awareness. There is the dorsal attention network too. This is the auditory. This is the sensory motor, and the visual. In terms of the big ones, there are others, and there are sub-networks that also work independently, and depending on what is happening in the brain, they integrate or not. So let's talk about the default mode network. It's comprised of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is aimed at reflexive and internalized attention, emotional regulation, reward evaluation, and theory of mind, which is the capacity to understand events from the perspective of a third person. And this is very important. The posterior cingulate cortex, which is involved with autobiographic memory, self-referential processing, spatial navigation, based on self-centered perspective. And the precuneus, together with the posterior cingulate, is an important hub for processing proprioceptive sense of self and for registering the conscious perception of the self during subjective immersive states. The medial temporal lobe is another hub of this network and includes the hippocampus and the parahippocampal gyrus for processing of episodic memory linked to personal past experiences in a given time and place. So, and the angular gyrus for evoking memories and semantic processing of language. This guy actively participates in attention processing and spatial cognition. Together with the ventromedial, it is responsible for theory of mind processing and mathematical operations. So this network is involved in self-referential cognitive abstract processes, estimation, assessment of probability of future scenarios, and autobiographic memory, sense of self, self-analysis, and moral judgment. This is the network that we actually activate when we close our eyes. This is where we find ourselves when we are reflecting on something, trying to project something in the future, trying to understand something that is happening with us. This is the network that is activated, that is working in these moments. When something is not working really well in this network, things, depending on the degree of the deregulation, you can go into depression, anxiety, and even schizophrenia. Okay. And the central executive network is functionally anti-correlated with the default mode network, which means that one relates to the inner world. The other is the one that operates when we really are acting in the world. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex relates to abstract reasoning, cognitive and executive functions. Superior parietal cortex is spatial attention, proprioception, and integration of the different sensorial modalities. So fundamentally, the central executive network is involved with the executive control of superior cognitive functions like planning, attention control, spatial navigation, keeping and manipulation of information in operational memory, the working memory, not to mention reasoning applied to decision-making and problem solution based on context-oriented rules. So this is the network that we operate when we are behaving in the world. So abnormalities here also can lead to depression, to ADHD and OCD more frequently, Alzheimer and schizophrenia, frontotemporal dementia also are related to degenerative processes in structures of this network, and autism. And finally, the third network, this is a very important network, the Salience Network, which emerges from the coordinated action of the frontal insular cortex, which is integrated in the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, and the anterior insula, responsible for dynamically switching, selecting, and recruiting the different functional networks moment to moment. So the right anterior insula is the structure that could be called the switch in the brain. It's this structure that the brain uses to determine which network is going to be active from one moment to the other, and it's selecting all the time. And this is a process that has to be very dynamic. If it is not, there is problems there. So the amygdala is also part of this network, and it is, many people a lot of time thought that the amygdala related to the processing of fear, and that is a wrong understanding. Actually, the amygdala is aimed at detection and signalizing of threats. The fear is what you feel on another level, which is on a higher level in terms of consciousness, in what regards with what the amygdala is doing. Anterior cingulate cortex, mainly its dorsal portion, is involved in error detection, appraisal, and regulation of emotional responses, especially the inhibition of the negative and automatic ones. Thus, involved in action selection and determining the relevance of an information in a given context. This is a network that is always looking for change in the environment and detecting that and informing the other networks in terms of what we're going to do next. So fundamentally, that is what the Salience Network is doing. This is just to illustrate what I just said. It is determining which network will go in the game next, and it switches among them from moment to moment. The Salience Network, when you have abnormalities in the activity of its hubs, can lead to depression, generalized anxiety, and even OCD. And so this is very important because people think of these conditions as that are all the same in no matter what person. And actually, nowadays, we understand that when you call something depression, you have to look inside the brain and understand what kind of malfunctioning or deregulation in these networks is happening that is leading to that clinical outcome that we end up calling depression or anxiety or OCD. And so we need to map, pinpoint where the deregulations are happening in each of these networks, and then train these networks back into the well-functioning. And once we do that, we take the patient out of the condition. And this is very, very interesting to watch and see. But this is not our main interest today. We want to go into meditation and how these networks operate and what is the role of these networks in the process of going into meditation and evolving into that. So, here is another, just another slide that shows for the different networks and the structures that are involved, what kind of impairment, communication deficits, social impairment, or repetitive behaviors, depending on the hubs and the networks that are involved in the problem there. And the treatments also will vary depending on the actual network that is mainly involved. So it varies in terms of the efficiency of the therapy that you are promoting, depending on the network that is suffering more there. So I'm not going to extend myself here. So the game field of meditation, as I mentioned earlier, are these main midline structures of the brain. And it comprises the frontal parietal system and the midline structures, like the medial prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate, the precuneus, posterior cingulate cortex, and the inferior parietal cortex. These are mainly the structures that we want to look into when we talk about meditation. And this is just something that I put here to make sure that everybody is on the same chapter here. This is a very, very important article. It's from Florine and Bailey. It was published in Neuroimage in 2015. And here they describe how the brain operates in terms of cross-frequency coupling. When brain areas communicate, first they will sync in slower frequencies like delta, theta, or even alpha. You could have beta here too. It's not in this main ruler here, but it's showing what kind of frequency is more common in each brain area for this transfer of information among areas. But beta, as we will see more ahead, will do that too. And what do they carry? They carry gamma. And gamma is the carrier of the actual programs, or let's call the functional updates for that the brain from one area to the other informs. And the whole brain depends on the flux of information, and that the commands from one area to the other really get there. And gamma envelopes these packages of information with instructions for the areas or structures where it's headed to, so that they receive the more recent plan of activity. And this happens very dynamically in the brain. Once we understood that, here we enter in meditation and how it operates in terms of these frequencies. So the frontoparietal system, which is actually a part of the central executive network, and the midline cortical and limbic structures of the default mode network need to sync in amplified levels of magnitude, which is amplitude, as we understand, through the signals produced by the thalamus, that is generating alpha, which correlates with the higher degree of information shared and transferred. So what is happening here is that you have anterior-posterior and posterior. You have movements that go from the frontal areas of the brain towards the back, and vice versa, from the more posterior areas of the brain towards the anterior ones. Here, schematically, is alpha and syncing from the thalamus and being produced towards the neocortex, and the more neocortically generated frequencies, which are beta and gamma, on the surface of the brain. And what is happening here is that we have fluxes of information going back and forth here, but not in a amplitude and magnitude that really enables consciousness to be processed and integrated as it should. Gamma, neocortically generated, is the carrier of cognitive information and is responsible for functionally adjusting network activity. That is what gamma is. Theta is generated by an anterior portion of the neocortex and limbic midline structures and is responsible for executive signalization. So it is interesting because one would expect that the frontal lobes would produce mainly beta, which is not the case. It's theta there. And then you have alpha, which is generated by the thalamus. So the takeaway here is that the higher the degree of connectivity and the larger the amplitude of the signal in alpha and theta, the larger the volume of shared information and information that is transferred. This is what basically we need to keep in mind. This is what explore in terms of where we're heading in meditation. So let's go. The meditative state is the mindfulness state, happens and it starts with a decrease in gamma production in the frontal midline areas, the anterior portion of the default mode network, with less recruitment of the dorsal portion of the medial prefrontal cortex, which is the home for the self-centered analytic narrative self, which is the I, the me, that part of us that is chattering all the time and criticizing and analyzing, and the reasoning and everything is seated there. So we need to have a decrease in the activity of these areas, which is marked by this decrease in gamma, and a flow of gamma towards the back portion of the head, with the increase of gamma production in the posterior brain areas, temporal, parietal, and occipital. So activity on the back portion of the brain leads to an increase in sensorial, experiential, centered in the present moment state that is named experiential self. This is very interesting because when we relax and we start to meditate, this is what actually is starting to take place. This experiential self sits in the posterior areas of the frontal parietal system of the central executive network. This is very interesting because it's not the default mode, but it's the central executive network. It's a network that we actually use when we are acting in the world, but this time we are acting in our inner world. Very interesting. And is the basis for the mindful state. So this flux, theta, carrying gamma, and it depends on the integration of all the structures that is done by alpha. So alpha puts everybody to talk, and theta creates the road for gamma to really flow backwards in the brain and start to promote the activity more intensely in the back, in the posterior areas of the central executive network. The flux in theta carrying gamma from the anterior portion towards the posterior portion of the brain happens triggered by increase in the oscillatory activity in the alpha range. That's just what I said. And this is crucial for the processes of synchronization that now start to take place between the structures of the two main functional networks here involved, the central executive network and the default mode network. So there is a change from the analytic narrative self, the chattering mind, to the experiential self, where you start to actually and really live the experience by itself and really become part of the experience when you are going down into meditation. Once you have reached that level of practice where meditation is really stable, and we all know the next stage or step is to put beta back. And this involves a flux of gamma to the opposite side or direction. So now it's alpha or beta that work as carriers for gamma. So the flux of gamma is carried in the alpha-beta range, departing from parietal and occipital areas towards the frontal lobes. This is only possible due to the creation a true field of optimized information transmission, a highly stable and coherent state of brain synchronization in the alpha-theta range. So that's why meditation is really the basis for everything else. So you need to have everything in the alpha-theta range highly synchronized for field of information to be present along the midline structures of the brain, allowing for the operational adjustments that gamma now produce, establishing cortical and cortico-thalamic loops of reverberations of coherent activity between these structures. So this is where you bring back your analytic mind to live the experience without interfering with it, but actually to take the most out of that and enable learning to take place and the whole deepness of the experience to be consciously lived and brought back into everyday life, which is something that we end up doing once we start eyes-opening training. The evolved mind, which is the next step, is a higher degree of connectivity, and the larger amplitude of the signals in alpha and theta have to be present with optimized levels of global synchronization in the brain that leads to a global integration of the activity of these brain networks. Now we're not just talking about the midline structures, we're talking about the cortex as a whole. And this is very interesting. It's a highly coherent and synchronic state of activity that is established through cortical and cortico-thalamic interactions in the gamma band. So now gamma is flowing everywhere, and alpha theta is enabling that to happen because the structures that process consciousness are really coherently integrated and working as a whole, as a single unit. And this is very interesting. This is the process that happens once we have made our way in both ways. So we learn how to bring activity to the back part of the brain and leave the experiential self. Then we learn to put beta back and bring analysis into the game. And now we are enabling state of high integration and coherence all throughout the neocortex, and this leads to a state of higher levels of consciousness and awareness, and this is a different state of being in the world and existing. This is a global workspace network in the brain. The syncing of frontal parietal system, the midline cortical structures, and even of the whole neocortex, highly functionally integrated. These arrangements of different brain areas and circuits code just like a kaleidoscope for mental representations that in this way become conscious. In this state, everything is flowing very vividly and fastly in the brain. This means that in this non-ordinary state of brain activity that is meditation, the emergence of this global workspace network, a graphic user interface between consciousness and the brain, is facilitated and enhanced and translates into high performance and higher states of consciousness. Nirvana is the state that emerges as a long-term effect of this practice and the state of functioning in the brain, the creation of this true field of optimized information transmission, a highly stable and coherent state of brain synchronization in the alpha theta range that the meditative state promotes along the midline structures of the brain, allows for the operational adjustments that gamma oscillations produce, establishing cortical-cortical and cortical-thalamic loops of reverberations of coherent activity. This is what is happening. In this state, there is no space for randomness or any kind of back noise, with global levels of negative entropy, which translates into levels of high organization and coordination of the cerebral function, allowing for the optimal levels of processing along the midline structures of the brain where the conscious information travels. In its max, this state of high synchronization and resonance of cortical and limbic structures of the brain midline in overlap with those of the frontal parietal system is a state, and this frontal parietal system enables us to bring this whole functioning into the world and function based on that. This is a state void of information content. For the late Professor Elroy John from Brain Research Lab from the New York University, this is what Buddhists call nirvana. And this is a state that, in my opinion, I can personally say that I have reached brief moments of this and very interesting states to be functioning in and experiencing. And I believe this is still a door to what the epigenetic fields of information, that's how he called, I don't remember his name. So we enter into levels of functioning and access of information that I believe relate to our species as a whole and what we call the unconscious and in a grander meaning. And this is an experience of light, and knowledge flows very vividly and freely, and it's very, very important to what I understand is our evolutionary process here. So this is it, and I believe that is really cool. It's really amazing that we can nowadays understand all this in such level of detail and know when we are in our practice what is actually happening inside our heads. This is really a map of our practice in terms of networks in the brain. And so this is what is described in my book. This is the book. And thank you very much. And I believe now we open for questions and let's discuss all this, right?
Fantastic, Leonardo. Absolutely fantastic. We are so lucky that you have this mind mirror foundation, being a mind mirror practitioner, and could put this together with everything that you've studied as a I guess, neuroscientist, neurophysiologist, because it really speaks to us. It really speaks to me in terms of gamma, because what you've said backs up everything I've been teaching as I picked it up from lots of different places and then saw it on the mind mirror. And then I'm going to get out of the way, but I want to ask you one question before I do open it up to other people. So this was very interesting to me. I've heard that gamma is produced all over the head, and then I heard that it's produced in the front of the head and it moves to the back. And then I've heard in some other studies that it moves from the back to the front. So you're saying that it does both. And as you go into meditation, it leaves the front and goes to the back, and then it connects up with, I guess it's being partly generated by or carried by theta, and then the alpha theta. And we can see this on the new composite summary windows. We can absolutely see the linkages and what kicks off first. And all we're measuring is the back of the brain, but we can see. And then it moves back to the front, which I guess is what's causing the neurogenesis in the frontal lobes and the rewiring of neural circuitry. And so then my question is, and I asked this question in Virginia, and I couldn't understand the answer that you gave until now, is that we've been talking about trying to find a way to map an awakened mind on the frontal lobes. And of course, that's easy enough to see what it looks. It looks pretty much the same pattern, except with more theta, more delta. The alpha peak drops from 10.5 to 9. But we wouldn't really, I guess we would be measuring, we could measure the drop out of the gamma from the frontal lobes as it moves to the back. And then we could measure, we would be measuring as it moves back up to the front, right?
Right.
So, but you were saying that where we're measuring with the mind mirror hookups is actually the best place. So can you just say a little bit more about that now that we have this background? That would make more sense.
Actually, gamma is a marker of where activity is mainly kept from moment to moment in the brain. It's very interesting because for you to go into meditation, we learned that we need to start, relaxation is the basis, right? And why is it the basis? Because once you relax, you start producing more alpha. And alpha is the basis for the synchronization of the frontal parietal system and the midline structures that are there, that right there, that banana that is inside the brain, the midline structures and the frontal parietal system. They enter into synchronicity, they sync, and they start to behave as one. This is the basis. This is where theta then, and we know that, that's the next step, theta enters, and enters doing what? Carrying the information backwards towards the parietal and posterior limbic structures that are involved in this process. And so we need to start producing more theta because we need the carrier to bring gamma into these structures and mark for the brain that that's where it has to operate, to function more mainly, I would say. So, or preponderantly. So the activity runs backwards, and then gamma is running on the back of theta. Theta is the carrier for gamma there, and is bringing, and the flow of theta brings gamma, allows gamma to flow backwards to these structures and start to put the meditator into this state of the experiential being, which is when you enter that, you know that you are with the activity really happening where it should be. And you have this silencing of the chatter mind, and you have this more deep experiences that you start feeling. We know that. all the sensations that are involved when you are going deep into meditation, which is where you see market production of higher amplitudes of theta, along with alpha. Alpha has to be there always, because if you don't have alpha, you don't have the synchronization of these structures along the midline, and you lose it. And that's why you lose the consciousness. If you don't have alpha and you have theta, we know that it's a state where we cannot access what is happening there. So we have alpha theta, and once we have alpha theta there, and we get this experience, and we know that just the act of reasoning and starting to put the analysis into the equation brings back activity in the frontal lobe. And this is how we start the flux of beta towards the frontal lobes, carrying gamma. So the frontal lobes start to get active. Both of them are kept active. That's when you are producing the awakened mind pattern.
Right.
Okay, so I don't know if I understood the question, if I answered the question actually.
Just to say, dare we try to find a frontal hookup for the awakened mind with 5 electrodes across the frontal lobe?
Nowadays, Judith, my understanding of this whole process, I imagine that what would be happening there once you get, because if we keep in mind all these stages that I just described, necessarily you would have to have a higher production of gamma, beta, and alpha in the frontals, not that much theta, I understand, but I couldn't even guess what it would look like.
Exactly like the awakened mind. That's the freaky thing. I mean, the whole idea that brainwaves resonate through the head. I mean, I've hooked myself up doing equipment testing literally hundreds of times, and it's always an awakened mind pattern with more amplitude and theta and delta, and not quite as much alpha, because alpha's coming out of the back of the bottom of the head. But the alpha's still there. It looks just like an awakened mind pattern. I mean, I even got an 80% training level 5 reward the other day with a frontal hookup, which is well into the range of, advanced meditators for the back of the head, where the alpha is. So that's, I mean, it could be a game changer for us, but we'll save that then for another conversation. And
let me just make a comment on what I'm thinking here, trying to understand myself what you're describing. But my understanding is that probably if you get a highly trained meditator, this flux back and forth is happening simultaneously and so intensely that you're going to get these other frequencies there necessarily, because they are all present. What I described is the very early stages of the process. Not when you see, when we went into the evolved mind and a little bit before with the awakened mind, you would see this flux of information happening both ways.
Yes.
And cortically, it's neocortically, it is everywhere. It's a highly integrated state. So you would necessarily be capturing there some theta, or but I would very much be interested in watching this whole description that I made in terms of the frontal lobes with someone that is learning to meditate.
Yes.
I think that's somewhere that we could go.
Sounds great. And can I ask you one more question? What's the deal with the midline? I mean, are you talking about a midline like here?
The midline kind of structures, yes. They are the cingulate cortex, and you have the medial prefrontal cortex, you have the precuneus, you have the posterior cingulate and the parietal areas. These structures they are the ones that process the sense of self in the brain. The consciousness happens along these midline structures when they work together. And now that you mention, it's interesting. In my first book, I mentioned that in France, they were utilizing kind of an apparatus that you would put to the back and the forth of the head, and it would run a magnetic field along these midline structures. And once they did that, the person would go into an anesthetic state, and they would operate these patients without anesthesia. They are doing that in France.
Wow. Amazing.
So once you block this integration along the midline structures, you're out. Interesting, eh?
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, I'm sure lots of other people have questions, so I will mute myself and invite everyone else to now ask what burning questions you have.
I just wanted to comment, and I mentioned this to Judith. I was working with some healers, healing touch people, and I haven't had too much. We're going to do more with them in January, so I haven't actually had too much time with them. But I did notice, and it goes back to what you were saying about the evolved mind, looking at the coherence on the mind mirror, their new coherence capability, when the coherence for the healer hit about 0.7, which she did briefly, and I looked at what was happening, I saw the evolved mind pattern. So it seemed that right at the moment of the highest coherence she was going into an evolved mind pattern, which only lasted for less than a minute on the recording. But so there seems to be a correlation there, or between high coherence on the mind mirror and the possibility of an evolved mind pattern. Now, I was just wondering if you'd seen that.
No, I haven't. I have to be really honest with you guys. I have been studying this last 3.5 years. I was writing this book, and my clinic here, I have assistants and everything, and I have a really busy business here. I haven't been doing meditation with patients. I myself, I do, but not doing this work in this last 3 or 4 years, because you don't do this in 30-40 minutes. It's a session will usually last with me for an hour and a half. I didn't have the time and availability that you need to take on this kind of work, which I love, and I'm looking forward to reconnect with it, really start doing it again. And I think when I start doing it, we're going to have much more to talk about. That's for sure. And your work with the healers, if you get the information that I just shared with you and the things that Judith is researching now, I think there is a whole field, the samadhis, so many states. One thing that I was talking to Anna months before she passed relates to the Kundalini work. And then because back then we were talking about developing the mind mirror with the higher frequencies, just as Judith ended up doing, which is I cannot express the gratitude for you to having done that, Judith. It is amazing. I ended up not having the opportunity to develop this kind of research, which interests me a lot, because I had Kundalini awakenings, at least 2 very clear moments of my meditation practice. And one of them was in our very first training with Anna, you remember, with the Ganesha meditation. That was amazing. And so this is something that I want to go into in terms of research and study. So I believe we're going to have more to talk when I reconnect with the work.
I have a question. So thank you, Leonardo, for this. I found it extremely fascinating. My name is Ken Sherman. I have the Loretta Z-Score, the NeuroGuide system.
That's the one I use here too.
Yes. Okay. So, and it's been working very successfully with anxiety and depression and everything else it claims to work with. But my passion and interest is more in these wakefulness, mindfulness, enlightenment. And the Neuro Guide doesn't help in that way at all. Training the default mode is the closest I can get to that, but it's basically not that. And I was wondering, do you have a way that you can train all of what you just discussed here?
You mean with Z-scores?
Well, I know I can't do it with Z-scores, but I'm wondering, are you familiar with the Brain Master software?
Yes.
Okay, because I have the DSI 24 dry headset, so it's easy to cap people and whatnot. Because the Neuro Guide doesn't go into gamma. I think it cuts off 32 hertz. So I'm trying to build a program where I can teach people how to meditate and enter these deep states. And it seems like from the presentation here, and this kind of points a little bit to what Judith was saying, that with the mind mirror, you can do all this occipitally, but you can't use it to train the frontal areas.
I wouldn't say that. And really, my understanding is that the genius of the mind mirror is, which is the genius of Cave and Blundell, is what they were able to, listen, if we could ever get in touch with these guys, I don't know how, but, ask them how they came up with these readings on the temporal lobes, and Judith is just showing that what you're reading back there is happening in the frontal too. So it gets to a point where it doesn't matter. Actually, it's more than it doesn't matter. You don't really train just the frontals. You train everything, and everything integrates. And we are, as human beings, I like to talk to my patients and clients, depending on what kind of work I'm doing here, it's a patient or client. And I describe the body as the Jarvis from Iron Man, So we, as spiritual beings, are just users of this Jarvis. But we are not the programmers. We just use it. Programmers probably are some very advanced extraterrestrial race. I believe that, because this cannot have come up out of nowhere. It's too, the more you study, the more you get convinced that it's too sophisticated to just have happened. I don't believe that we are in a position, evolutionarily speaking, where we have enough knowledge or comprehension of what this all relates to. Imagine that we are able to know if we interfere in this process in a certain area and not in another, so that we are going to be able to get this and this result or otherwise. So what I mean is we have a knowledge that enables us to finally interact with this Jarvis, and this interaction allows us to go other places in terms of higher levels of consciousness. And the beauty of it is that this whole process is previewed in the brain. It's there. It's just waiting for us to walk this path, to walk it, to live this process. But it's there, and it's not for us to interfere with what is there. It's just for us to leave the experience and get to the other side, and whatever the other side reveals to be. That's my opinion.
Okay, thank you. So basically, it sounds like the mind mirror would accomplish what I'm looking for, and all of what you discussed, increasing alpha, theta, allowing that to be the carrier.
The mind mirror is, in my opinion, listen, it's my opinion, but from everything that I've studied and even showed you guys here today, mind mirror is complete. It is enough in itself, and it's amazing. It's really, and I'm so glad that I really had the opportunity to really start in neurofeedback with Anna Wise and this study. Amazing.
Okay, so it sounds like a successful program would be utilizing the mind mirror to assist people in achieving kind of what you've talked about today.
Yeah.
And then where there are certain areas of difficulty, I might use the Loretta Z-score.
What you're asking is another thing that led me to the Z-scores work. Because I understood that when I started really going deep into the studies, and this is interesting to share with you guys, I understood that the neocortex has to work as a insulating structure because everything has to be integrated in the brain. And these lower frequencies, they have to be contained inside this thing that we're talking. When you have disorders like depression or ADHD, or you have what you could call leakages, because these are where you have hypofunction of a given area, and you have, so it loses its capacity of containing, and you have these lower frequencies that then come out and interfere with the neocortical functioning. They shouldn't be there, at least not the way they show up. They should be there integrated in a whole in terms of what the brain is allowing and bringing into place. This explains why some people, when they go into meditation, you have heard of these cases, I'm sure everybody here has, that some people have a hard time explaining why. And not just meditation, but this body work that you go to these workshops in the weekends, and the guy starts to pressing certain points of acupuncture and everything, and the person has a bad trip, and no one understands why. And the problem is, in my opinion, that's the reason, because before you start any kind of work like this, and this is what I do nowadays here in my clinic, I do a neurological assessment of the person. And I see if there are deregulations of these networks, and that could lead into conditions, because you have to bear in mind that meditation leads to the stimulation of the increase in amplitude of theta, and theta is related to depression, ADHD, and everything. So you can lead someone to a condition like this if you do not map what is happening in the brain before. So this is why I started studying Z-score training in the first place. And then it led me to what Margaret Ayers discovered and described, which are the signatures, EEG, the electroencephalographic signatures of each of these conditions, which confirm what I'm telling you. And you see, be it on theta, be it on fast beta, high beta. So what you need to do, you even have what a normal brain activity is. You have to bring back before you move on, you have to bring back the brain into a normal state of function, where the networks, the regulations that are present are really freed from, the brain is freed from these deregulations, and this can take 1 year, 1.5 years of work. And then when you have everything okay, then you can go into meditation, because you know that the theta that you're going to stimulate is integrated, is not invasive, if you understand what I mean.
Yes, I do. Okay, that's very interesting. I will give a lot of thought to that. Thank you.
But that's a state approach, isn't it, Leonardo? Whereas Anna's approach was a content approach. Dive down theta that'll stabilize the alpha. Once you've got your alpha theta, you connect with your essential being. Your essential being shows you the answer to the problem. You fix the problem, then your theta straight. And
you can do that through content, but sometimes it's very difficult to do that. And if you don't do that the right way, it is a problem, right? So my understanding after studying all this is that go into state and really map, see where the problems are. In the meantime, once you normalize these deregulations, you see many of the complaints and symptoms go away, really.
You mean
and then the content part
from the level of state, the issues will go away? They'll cease to matter?
No.
Once you normalize the deregulation, many of the complaints, the clinical symptoms that the person was bringing, attention deficits, emotional issues and everything, they go away or they are left to a level that the person can, him or herself, deal with. But then this is where you have the ideal, in my opinion, state to start a meditation program with the person. This is the basis for going and then doing the content job that we so well know. And that reminds me from the temples in Tibet, how in India also with the ashrams, and when a disciple used to be, I don't know nowadays how they do that, but when the disciple is accepted, the first thing they do is not meditation. The first thing they do is, if it is in India, is yoga. If it is in Tibet or China, is like Kung Fu or something like that. Because you regulate the cerebral activity through the work that you do with the autonomic nervous system. When you bring balance back to the parasympathetic, sympathetic, autonomous nervous system. So once you do that, and I remember Anna Wise explaining this, I believe you would remember this too, that the relaxation process that we start with, this kind of balancing of the structures, and this by itself already almost puts you into this, but this sometimes takes time depending on the problem that the person brings. That's why sometimes it's really hard for you just with meditation to expect that the brain will self-regulate, because the brain gets conditioned in a certain way of functioning. And it's very hard for you to break up with this state sometimes. Sometimes not, but sometimes yes. And not every time it is necessarily related to content. Sometimes it's just pure state. And even if you go into content work, you won't solve the problem there.
We use the emotional freedom technique.
Tapping.
The tapping, the energy psychology. And what we found, in fact, is actually the first thing goes back to what you're saying. It's the first thing that we start training people in, besides the relaxation, but also in the technique of tapping, so that as emotional content comes up, they're able to release it themselves, or with a counselor to do that more quickly. But what we also see is that as people are doing this, that as they clear the emotions, we've actually monitored them as they're doing this. We can see as they clear the emotions, the theta and alpha comes out, and they go more towards an awakened mind pattern as they release the emotions. And so it can happen very, very quickly.
I completely believe, and I'm not saying otherwise. I'm just saying that sometimes you can run into this kind of problems that I'm describing here that relate.
Definitely. And because we work with a large audience, you never know exactly. They're not screened to begin with. But if people begin to have issues like that, then of course we refer them to a therapist, either a neurofeedback therapist or a psychologist, a counselor, to deal with more difficult issues.
Thank you, Leonardo, for all of your talk today, and I can't wait to read your new book. And it's really exciting that you got to know Anna for so many years there at the end of her life, because we were dear friends with her too.
Yeah, well, I think we all miss her very much.
Yes.
I can only say that those were one of the most amazing times of my life. I would go to the US like 8 times in a year, I imagine.
Wow.
We got to that. It was like I couldn't wait. Like I was coming back and already, when I'm coming back to Brazil, but when am I coming back to the US? And I really want to apologize just for my English. I hope that
No problem.
No, it's wonderful. Could we? When are you going to translate this chapter into English? We just want this chapter.
I hope that the whole book, because the whole book talks about everything that we're talking now.
Okay.
I think it could help a lot, everybody.
Let us know if you're coming back to California. We'd love to meet with you sometime.
Yeah, we were fortunate that we only lived a couple of hours away from Anna, so it was fairly easy for us to get over there.
We could go down to Esalen in just a few hours and be with her and assist her.
Well, you know what? I think this is aching. Why is it? Amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leonardo.
We have so many great memories of training together with Anna. Leonardo and I did. We had a wonderful class. And one of the coolest things that Anna loved to talk about was that she was at Esalen one training and Leonardo was there, and she got really uncomfortable and needed some help in the middle of the night. And so she used her Delta to start signaling Leonardo, who was in several rooms away. Leonardo heard her, and it was 2:00 in the morning, and Leonardo went and tapped on her door and said, "Anna, are you all right?" And she said, "Well, I've been calling you," mentally. And she just loved that.
And she was such a really amazing person, and even more amazing teacher, that in the end of all that embraced us with so much love, Judith. It was really fantastic. So anyway, I think we're done here, and I really want to thank everybody for the patience with me and my English here. But I believe that if I have the opportunity to choose in my next life, I'm going to be a native speaker of English. Because I really love so much your country. It is somewhere that I really feel good and I can connect with people. And I think you guys have this sharing thing and community thing. And I think it's amazing, something that here in Brazil, paradoxically, even though people come and say, oh, people are so, warm and receptive, but you don't have that kind of, interaction and the sense of being part of a community. And I believe that relates to probably history or things. There is a process, historical process to get to these things. So anyway, thank you very much. And really, it's been a privilege to do this presentation. Judith, thank you for the opportunity, really. You are a friend, as I said, a friend for life. And Oksana, too, always with this smile on the face. And thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Leonardo. We appreciate it. Can't say how much. I feel like this is going to be a sort of cornerstone of information for us to build on and to be able to understand more about why this awakened mind work is so incredibly effective. You've just shown us in terms of brain networks and invaluable information. I mean, we'd have had to study for the years you have to put this together so that you synthesized it all and were able to present it so clearly. Roxanne, anything you want to close with?
Oh, I just want to thank you, Leonardo, because yes, it was amazing and very, rich in content and relevant to what we do in content. And I think this is really the future. Leonardo, after your presentation, I have completely different understanding, not just dynamics and networks, but more like what do we mean by the depth of meditation? What's behind, how the energy flows and the information flows within the mind. And then what I also could see, that your work is actually very, very advanced. And I can really see the future where something like meditation and brain training, it's like brushing teeth every day. And I was like even thinking, what do you think about the future of, this whole work? Because you can see that almost like any mental disorder will be related to some kind of, brain disorder or brain needed to be optimized.
Yes. I think you put it in a very precise and clear way, and it is exactly like that. And our understanding of this whole thing that we call the brain is really advancing a lot, but there's so much to do and so much to really study and understand. And that's why I love it, because there is no, I've seen this. No, every day is news. Every day is something new, and I just love it. So, yes, this is one field that we can be sure we're going to be thrilled every day, one after the other. It's going to be amazing. What a privilege to be here and being studying all this. Thank you.
Yes, and it is a great contribution to the evolution of humanity. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for attending. We'll see you next month with David Fairweather on he is going to talk about peak performance and how to succeed at whatever you want to do. And some of the same concept of clean out the subconscious and get those thought patterns out of the way in order to succeed. So hope you'll join us for that. And thank all of you for being here. Till next time, namaste.